Moving on, I would now like to call upon our next presenter, who's no less than an award-winning designer, the man behind multiple renowned projects all across Vietnam and other places, other countries, other continents. Can I please have upon stage Andrew Currie, Managing Director of Out2 Design.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. That's probably the best and most impressive introduction I've ever had. And now I can look forward to, at some stage, getting my photograph taken, I think. So I'll have to look good as well. Just for my knowledge, can I just see a show of hands for how many people are actually from Ho Chi Minh City or have come into here from Ho Chi Minh? Okay. And how many are involved in the design industry? Okay, well that's great. All right, just before I get started, just something to consider during the time we have my talk. Something to think about, the sun. Just to consider this in the context of the value we add and sustainability that I'll touch a little bit on. Just to consider that every 2 minutes, the energy reaching the Earth from the sun is equal to the entire annual consumption of humanity. So if we consider that and just consider how that might change the way we think about energy, it can have a huge impression, of course. So, back to this title, Designing Socio-Ecological Value. So even I had to think about this one when I was introduced to the title. So what do we mean by that? So let's break it down a little bit. Designing. So some of you might recognize some of these famous designers that I've got up on screen here. But obviously the stereotypical image of the solo individual designer working away by themselves on amazing designs, individual geniuses. But in fact, if we think a bit more or consider architecture as much more and design as much more of a social act, then it involves a lot more players than just the individual architects. The first, of course, are people. The social aspect of architecture and design. And the people involved in the making of buildings are diverse and numerous, from the architects to the consultants, to many of us here who are in the process of making buildings. For the people who use the buildings, of course, and understanding or making decisions and evaluations on what is good architecture, again, it involves a whole range of people and a wide and broad spectrum of society who judges. The next, of course, is ecology, the earth. Very topical these days. And I guess for me, I'd like to, well, I'm not busting a myth, but the myth that the earth is fragile, for me, is not true. I mean, the earth is robust and will outlive us all. Plastics, pollution, deforestation is not going to kill the earth, it's just going to kill us and the other people and beings that live on the earth. So, you know, the earth, as I said, will out-survive us. So the ecological impact and responsibility we have as makers of buildings and cities is really for our own benefit, not the earth's. The third dynamic is, of course, buildings, the places and the spaces we make. And this is our contribution, really, as the makers of buildings, to the socio-economic value. Then we come to Vietnam. If we put it in this context of sort of rapid and pervasive change, and considering also what Stephen was just talking about, how that is destined to continue here, it's only going to get more rapid and more pervasive. But if we think for a minute of how things have traveled in the last 10 years, 10 years ago I chaired a seminar or a conference on sustainability called Lean and Green. And 10 years ago there was no Lotus certification system, so the Vietnam Green Building Council was in its infancy. The LEED Green certification wasn't really recognized then as an international standard. And we were looking at a project in Phu Quoc at that stage where we wanted to make it net zero energy and produce its own power. And for a small resort project, the solar power component was going to cost, or the investment in that was well over $100,000. Last year, we looked at that same project and the cost of powering it by solar was less than $18,000 for the same size resort. So we have come a long way in 10 years, but obviously not far enough. If we look at what's been happening in other cities around the world in this same period, or more or less the last 5 years, I've been spending a lot of time in Melbourne, and we see buildings taking on a much more active role in their contribution to using less power and more sustainable systems. This is the Pixel building in Melbourne, one of the first net zero energy buildings in Melbourne. Obviously quite a small building, but it uses a number of systems that you can see there. It's using wind power, it uses solar, it uses a very complex geometry to filter the sun. And what you can't see there in the pictures is it actually filters all of its wastewater through a series of reed beds on each floor to treat it to potable conditions, although it's just then reused for services in the building. We've also seen big advances, I guess, in the greening of buildings. In most cases to date, this has been more decorative than any other reason, although we're starting to see projects like One Central in Sydney and the Bosco really creating, I guess, ecosystems, new ecosystems, and introducing those into the city that are of a scale that actually changes the total ecosystem of the city. I'm sure there's anybody that's involved in property management here who's looking at these and thinking, okay, they're really just going to result in problems down the track, and I know that the buildings in Sydney are getting some criticism now. So that, I agree, is a major challenge. But notwithstanding, it is making a different ecological impact, and through that impact, having an impact on the social change as well. And then the new, I guess the latest buildings that are using these sorts of hybrid technologies where they're introducing power generation, water treatment, and the inclusion of vegetation and crops into the building is something that I think is going to become more prevalent. Also, as building codes and certification, environmental certification codes continue to merge. So then we have Saigon, and of course, being involved in the making of buildings, we really have to think about and ask ourselves the question, what are we doing here? What is our contribution through design and through construction to the ecology and to society, as well as to the economy? Don't have an answer for you, but I think it's just something that we need to be considering in this sort of state of change that we're in. Slightly different approach. That said, everyone will be familiar with these photos of what's been happening in Hawaii recently, and the idea of creative destruction. So we do need to destroy things to make new things. and nature does this all the time. Australia is famous for its bushfires and then the regeneration that comes after that. And the cities are really no different in that we need to regenerate the city. Anything that's living needs to regenerate, and that includes our cities. Every one of these buildings in Sydney has had an impact on the ecology of the city, on society in that city, and of course on the environment. This is the only technical slide I'm going to show, but it just looks at the opportunity that we have as makers of buildings to influence projects, and that influence really comes at the very early stage of projects rather than at the latter stages. So where we can see here in the purple is where we have the greatest influence on the outcomes. Once the building starts really getting built, we have less and less influence. So we have to enter into our projects with the mindset that we're going to make a positive contribution through those projects in all of those areas, not just economically. And if we look around at what's been happening again in this sort of time frame, there's great examples everywhere. I'm sure everyone knows Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. It was actually envisaged in 2003 originally. Took them till 2012 to actually realize it. I think there's something like 7 million different types of plants there, and well within the realm of city making for people to do this. Not sure if any of you will recognize this photo. It's a photo of Sydney before, of course, the Opera House was built. An old industrial site on the water that was given over to the Opera House. And of course, an iconic piece of architecture was made, but it changed the social value of the site and the harbourfront. And in doing that, it changed, or it allowed for the ecological value of the whole waterfront to also be valued greater by society and by the country. And so the iconic building started to build, of course, the iconic city. And now that continues. So I think around the foreshore of Sydney, there's about 7 kilometres of foreshore that's now been redeveloped into various forms of development and public spaces. Another example here on an industrial riverfront. Again, I'm not sure if anyone recognizes it, but it was Bilbao. So when the Guggenheim was built there, a piece of architecture transformed the city, transformed it socially, transformed it economically, and will also have an ecological effect there. And again, we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing here? What's our contribution in Vietnam? If we look at the Saigon riverfront, this is a bit of an old photo, so it's changed a little bit since then. But the Saigon riverfront on the west side, the city side, is around 6 kilometres of waterfront that's available there. If we go across the river to Tu Tim, that adds another 6. So we've got more sort of waterfront available to us here than Sydney does. And a lot of that is industrial space that is about to be redeveloped. So we really have to take that seriously. We've got an amazing city. So if we think, what is our contribution through society? As it was said, it's the second most dynamic city in the world. Maybe if we treated our waterfront a little differently, it might be the first most dynamic and exciting city in the world if we had some space there. But we have a very, very good base to work from. And then, of course, what is our contribution through ecology? So we see the emergence of urban gardening. We see the emergence, particularly in other places, of community gardening. And all of those things are available to us here as well. So the future, I'll leave you with one thought. now on my last slide, that the future is not a place we're going, it's a place we're creating. Thank you.
That was indeed a wonderful presentation. Who wants to ask any questions for Andrew? He's all available to you. Any questions? No? How many of us are Vietnamese? Natives? And you have no questions in designing the socio-ecological value of your own country? Oh, we have.
Your involvement in the Vietnam Green Building Council, just interested in your thoughts as to what do you think are the challenges in getting developers and fellow consultants here in Vietnam to really understand the value that Vietnam Green Building Council can bring to developments, and is there an appetite for its adoption?
Good question. It has certainly gone through a cycle, I would say. There was a lot of interest, certainly, a couple of years ago, where I think many projects and many of the clients we would see in commercial business would be interested in being greener, in certification, in developing projects with an environmental agenda. I think that in many cases, because they didn't really understand the process of doing that and what it meant in terms of a commitment to doing things a certain way. I don't think it's ever going to push ahead to the extent we need it to until the government changes regulations and both incentivizes building better buildings, but also legislates for better building practice. I think we see overseas that the certification systems, LEED, Green Star, and others are at the cutting edge, but following not far behind that are actually the building codes who are starting to adopt the environmental practices into standard building practices as it moves forward. And then I think we've just seen, and I haven't read the details of it, but we've just starting to see some discussion now around, and other people may know more about this than I do, about the ability now to produce solar power and sell it to the grid here, or to use it in your own buildings. So to date, I only know of one building that's been able to do this, which is the UN greenhouse in Hanoi. But I think, that will be one, but when buildings start to, I think the big change will come when buildings start to produce their own power and treat their own waste and become basically self-sufficient on site. And I would think that's within the next 5 years we'll see that.
Any more questions? Oh, we have one beautiful lady there.
Thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. I'm Mai from Indonesian Engineering, and I just see some positive points in the green building markets, but in your opinion, I would love to hear about the main challenges in the green building market.
Certainly here in Vietnam, cost is still an issue. You see a lot of presentations where people say the cost of a green building is less than 5% more than the cost of a normal building. That is, that's as bad as saying that the earth is fragile and won't get damaged. It's not, because the baseline here of construction is so low. Yeah, those kind of figures work overseas, where you have a high building quality as a minimum standard, but here it's a very different cost to start to achieve just the quality of insulation, those sorts of building, basic building components that set you up then for adding on some environmental features at not much more cost. So that's the biggest challenge I think here that we see is shifting the baseline construction and then I guess pushing that further to be more environmental. That's one. The other is I think that our industry, the architecture and construction industry, doesn't really push it enough. Yeah, they don't advocate enough for better buildings and for better or more responsible consumption. If there was more of that at that beginning stage of a project. All of the environmental projects that we've worked on, I would say, well, most of them, have started because we've started a conversation even prior to designing the building to say, can we consider and can we try and convince you that there's a better way to do this? And it's only when the client's open to that it moves forward.
Then, I think that was very, very insightful, and thank you so much for sharing your experience. And as Andrew pointed out, I think the key is to involve the designer right at the planning stage of the project. So everything has time and money to be done and completed well within the stipulated times and budgets.
Yeah, I just say the designer and the other key players. Yeah,
Yes.
it's a collaboration.
Of course it is. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. And to give away his plaque, can I call upon stage Mr. Ko Moi Kwong from Ascender Signbridge. And don't worry, Andrew, you look super handsome as always. Would you mind taking the center? Yeah, sure. Yes, that's right. Thank you. A huge round of applause. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you so much.